What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 6.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 6, let's take a look at my starts and sits. So at the quarterback position, I'm going to start off with an obvious start. I'm going to start Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Ben Roethlisberger has averaged 20.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.3 rush attempts per game. He's been pretty consistent, scoring 21, 19, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 19.9 fantasy points here in Week 6. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Steelers favored by 3.5. So you got a high-scoring game, a great matchup here. Big Ben's been good this season, so I'm going to start Ben Roethlisberger here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, this next start is not so obvious. I'm going to start Ryan Fitzpatrick from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Ryan Fitzpatrick has averaged 21.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.8 rush attempts per game. He scored 28, 23, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's been on fire. Now this projection is way too low here. Not sure why it's so low. I'm going to up this projection. It says he's only projected at 14.7 fantasy points here in Week 6, but I'm going to put him at least 20 fantasy points in this one. Now you could make the case that the Miami Dolphins are going to roll over the Jets and they're going to run the ball, but I think this is going to be a closer game than a lot of people think. These divisional matchups are usually close games. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick continues his momentum here, so I'm going to start Ryan Fitzpatrick here versus the New York Jets. Another quarterback I'm going to start is Gardner Minshew from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Gardner Minshew has averaged 19.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.6 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 19.3 fantasy points here in Week 6. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 54 points scored in this game, with the Jacksonville Jaguars trailing by 3.5. So you got a high-scoring game, a good matchup, and a passing game script. So I'm going to start Gardner Minshew here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, who are we going to sit here at the quarterback position? I've got a couple of quarterback sits for you. I'm going to sit Carson Wentz from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Carson Wentz is averaging 18.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.6 rush attempts per game. Now, he's played pretty well the last 3 weeks, scoring 19, 22, and 24 fantasy points, but he's only projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in week 6. Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. Only 46.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Eagles trailing by 7.5. So I don't like this matchup for Wentz. So I'm going to sit Carson Wentz here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Another quarterback I'm going to sit is Baker Mayfield from the Cleveland Browns playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield is only averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.2 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 15.3 fantasy points here in week 6. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Cleveland Browns trailing by 3.5. So Baker Mayfield was a little banged up last week. He's questionable going into week 6. Even if he plays, which I think he's going to play, I don't like the matchup here, so I'm going to sit Baker Mayfield here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start Alexander Mattison from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Alexander Mattison, now he's only averaged 7.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.8 rush attempts per game and about 2 pass targets per game. But remember, Alexander Mattison is the backup to Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook got injured last week, and it looks like he's going to be out for week 6. And Alexander Mattison took over for Dalvin Cook. He got 20 rush attempts and 3 pass targets last week. Turn that into 15 fantasy points. So he's going to get a heavy workload here in week 6. He's projected at 10.8 fantasy points here in week 6, but I think you can bump that up to at least 15 fantasy points. He's going to get plenty of touches. He's got a great matchup. Vegas thinks there's going to be 55.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Vikings favored by 3.5. So you got a high-scoring game, a running game script. So I'm going to start Alexander Mattison here versus the Atlanta Falcons. The next running back I'm going to start, it seems like this guy has a good matchup every week. He hasn't really put in a fantastic fantasy football game yet, but I think he finally has a big week here in week 6. So I'm going to start David Johnson from the Houston Texans playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Johnson has averaged 11.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13.6 rush attempts per game and 3.6 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 80% of the snaps. He touches the ball 37% of that time. He got 17 rush attempts last game and 4 pass targets, only turned it into 11 fantasy points, but with that kind of volume and a good matchup, I think he's poised to have a breakout week here. He's projected at 12.7 fantasy points here in week 6. So I'm going to start David Johnson here versus the Tennessee Titans. Another running back that I'm going to start is Myles Gaskin from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Myles Gaskin has averaged 11.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.8 rush attempts per game and 5 pass targets per game. Gaskin had a bad matchup last week, and he still managed to score 18 fantasy points off of 16 rush attempts and 5 pass targets. He's projected at 11.1 fantasy points here in week 6. Now he's got a great matchup here versus the Jets in a game that the Miami Dolphins should be playing with a lead, so it could mean more volume here for Myles Gaskin. So I'm going to start Myles Gaskin here versus the New York Jets. Okay, who are we going to sit here at the running back position? It's kind of hard to do this, but if you have other options at the running back position, I'm going to sit Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the absolute best defense overall. They give up the third fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has averaged 15 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 20.2 rush attempts per game and 4.6 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 67% of the snaps. He's projected at 14.5 fantasy points here in week 6. Now, he's getting a ton of volume, but he's got an awful matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. 46.5 points scored in this game, with the Cincinnati Bengals trailing by 8. So it could be a passing game script for the Bengals. If you don't have any other options, you got to start Joe Mixon. But if you have some other decent running backs on your roster, I'm going to sit Joe Mixon here versus the Indianapolis Colts.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. Okay, so another obvious start here, but it may not be that obvious because he hasn't really played all that well this season. So I'm going to start Juju Smith-Schuster from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Juju Smith-Schuster, he's averaged 12.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 81% of the snaps, projected at 10.9 fantasy points here in week 6. But I think he has a breakout week here. He's got a fantastic matchup versus the Cleveland Browns. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Steelers favored by 3.5. I just love this matchup. I think Juju Smith-Schuster is due for a breakout game here. So I'm going to start Juju Smith-Schuster here versus the Cleveland Browns. Another wide receiver I'm going to start is Devontae Parker from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Devontae Parker has averaged 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.4 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 76% of the snaps. He's projected at 12.9 fantasy points here in week 6. He scored 12, 16, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. Now, he only got 3 pass targets last game, but he got 12 pass targets the game before that. I think he's involved in a big way here in this win over the Jets. So I'm going to start Devontae Parker here versus the New York Jets. Okay, another wide receiver I'm going to start is Justin Jefferson from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Justin Jefferson has averaged 10.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 73% of the snaps, projected at 12.9 fantasy points here in week 6. Now, he only scored 4 fantasy points last week off of 5 pass targets. But remember, with Dalvin Cook out, I think he gets more volume here this week. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 55.5 points scored in this game, with the Vikings favored by 3.5. So I love this matchup versus a bad Atlanta Falcons defense. So I'm going to start Justin Jefferson here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, who are we going to sit at the wide receiver position? I've got a couple of sits for you. I'm going to sit Marvin Jones Jr. from the Detroit Lions playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who do have the 4th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers, but Marvin Jones Jr. has only averaged 6.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.8 pass targets per game. Now, despite being on the field for 90% of the snaps, he only got 2 pass targets last game, 3 pass targets the game before that. Just not enough passing volume for me to want to start this guy. He is projected at 10.3 fantasy points here in week 6. And Vegas thinks it's going to be a high-scoring game. 54 points scored in this game, with the Detroit Lions favored by 3.5. But I don't trust the volume of Marvin Jones Jr., so I'm going to sit Marvin Jones Jr. here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Another player I'm going to sit is Golden Tate from the New York Giants playing the Washington Redskins, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Golden Tate has only averaged 5.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.8 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 70% of the snaps, projected at 8.5 fantasy points here in week 6. But if he couldn't get it done versus the Cowboys last week, he's not going to get it done against the Washington football team. He only scored 6 fantasy points last week off of 5 pass targets. He had a dream matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys defense. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. Only 43 points scored in this game, with the Giants favored by 3. So I'm going to sit Golden Tate here versus the Washington football team. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson has averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 72% of the snaps, and he scored 10, 7, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's been a consistent tight end week in and week out. He's projected at 9.1 fantasy points here in week 6. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 54 points scored in this game, with the Lions favored by 3.5. Great matchup here for Hawkinson. So I'm going to start TJ Hawkinson here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, if you're struggling at the tight end position, I've got a couple of borderline starts for you here. Now, if you're struggling at the tight end position, I got a couple of borderline starts for you here this week, mostly based on the matchups. I'm going to start Evan Ingram from the New York Giants playing the Washington football team, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram has averaged 6.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.4 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 88% of the snaps. Now, he only got 2 pass targets last week, but he did turn it into 9 fantasy points. He's projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 6. Now, Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. Only 43 points scored in this game. The Giants favored by 3. But I like the matchup here for Evan Ingram. So if you're struggling at the tight end position, I think this is a borderline start here. I think he could finally have a big week in this matchup. So I'm going to start Evan Ingram here versus the Washington football team. Another tight end I'm going to start is Eric Ebron from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Eric Ebron has averaged 6.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 73% of the snaps. Now, he only scored 5 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets, but I like the volume that he's getting. He got 6, 7, and 5 pass targets in the last 3 weeks. He's projected at 7.4 fantasy points here in week 6. So you got a great matchup for Eric Ebron here this week. So if you're looking for a tight end to start, I think he can score 10 fantasy points or more. So I'm going to start Eric Ebron here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, who are we going to sit at the tight end position? It pains me to do this, but I'm going to sit Zach Ertz from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a good defense overall, and they've been middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Zach Ertz, he's only averaged 6.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game, and despite being on the field for 92% of the snaps, he really hasn't done a lot this year. Only scored 1 fantasy point off of 6 pass targets last week, and 5 fantasy points off of 5 pass targets the game before that. He's projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 6. Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game, 46.5 points scored in this game, with the Eagles trailing by 7.5. Now, I could be wrong here. It could be the breakout game for Zach Ertz, but I don't think it comes versus the Baltimore Ravens. If you're struggling at the tight end position, go ahead and play Zach Ertz. But if you have better options, I'm going to sit Zach Ertz here versus the Baltimore Ravens.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.